there is an awful lot to cover as a result of how, the pace of events in relation to the situation in Ukraine right now. I'm going to do my best to be brief so that we can have a considerable amount of time for discussion, because I know that there's a lot of questions that people will have about what's going on. What we've been seeing over the course of the past 10 days is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has created a humanitarian crisis that is actually having impacts not just in Europe, although centrally in Europe, but having impacts at various different spots around the world. The tactics of the Russian army as they have invaded have become increasingly brutal over the course of the last 48 hours. We've been seeing significant increases in civilian casualties as the Russians launch much more significant attacks against civilian areas. The pictures, for example, coming out of Kharkiv today are of a city that has been largely destroyed by the Russian attacks that have come down. It's difficult to get exact estimates on the numbers of dead, but there's at least 700 civilians have been killed. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers have also been killed. We're now in a situation where 1.7 million people have fled Ukraine to various neighboring countries, causing a further humanitarian crisis on the borders. And this is sort of continuing. There are peace talks that have been ongoing, but at present the peace talks are not actually providing a peaceful solution to the situation. They have not actually been able to move past the impasses that exist between the Ukrainian government and the Russian government. Many of the peace talks right now have been centered around the idea of creating ceasefires to create humanitarian corridors to be able to get people out of areas where the fighting is harshest at this point. However, there have been numerous attempts at this over the course of the past number of days, and at present none of them have been successful. Both sides accuse the other of breaking any ceasefires. It's really impossible for us to be able to get any accurate information about who is breaking them, but either way, civilians are now being caught in the middle of this. And it's going to be a continuing humanitarian crisis for the people of Ukraine over the next little while. And there is also, of course, in this process, an increasing pressure on both the European Union, NATO, and the other NATO countries to increase weapon systems, to bring more advanced weapon systems to Ukraine, and increasing calls from the Ukrainian government to create a no-fly zone over top of Ukraine to stop the Russian Air Force from being able to dominate the skies. At present, NATO has decided against engaging in a no-fly zone, which is ultimately a good thing. We will hear an awful lot of calls for it, but a no-fly zone would mean a direct confrontation between NATO and Russian planes in the skies over top of Ukraine. And although the Ukrainian government is calling for a no-fly zone, I think we need to be abundantly clear that in the event that there is a conflict between NATO and Russia over top of Ukraine, it will destroy the country. It will mean much more devastation meted out against the Ukrainian people, and it's something that has to be stopped, and also potentially takes us towards the opening of what it's trending online now, World War III. And so we are seeing that this war is reshaping sort of politics around the globe. It's also having significant impacts in other respects, in particular the massive increase in the oil prices as a result of the attacks, and also increases in other sets of commodities. The most crucial one in many respects is wheat. Wheat prices have been going up significantly. Both Ukraine and Russia export considerable amounts of wheat around the world. And the UN World Food Program is desperately concerned that we are going to be in a situation where 1 billion people will no longer be able to afford to feed themselves. And in fact, if we are in a situation where we have literally billions of people who can't afford bread, that's going to result in further chaos globally. At present, the response from the West has been sanctions, mainly sanctions on Russian oligarchs of various different kinds, Russian billionaires. And it's something that is having something of a pinch, but is not actually sort of stopping the Russians at this point. And part of the reason for that, and I think that this is part of what is behind Putin's calculations, and I'll get into it a little bit more, is that the Western powers, in particular Western Europe, still does not want to cancel Russian oil and gas shipments to Western Europe, and they are refusing to employ sanctions against Russian oil and gas. So how did we get here? The sort of shatter belt of Eastern Europe, that is the conflict zone between the NATO powers and Russia, has been something of a considerable conflict zone for a number of years. Since the fall of the Eastern Bloc in the end of the Cold War, I'm going to start with that. There is a further older history, and there's a link that I think we're going to be setting up into the chat that allows people to dig into some of much older history of what's going on in the region. But I'm going to start with the collapse of the Cold War. As Faylene explained at the beginning here, one of the things that was happened, of course, at the end of the Cold War was Western powers, Western corporations moved in on the Eastern Bloc and pillaged as much as they possibly could of the wealth that had been developed over the course of the previous 100 years. NATO promised Russia that they would not expand any further eastward into what Russia considered to be its legitimate sphere of influence. Almost immediately, NATO reneged on that promise and began expanding eastward. In doing so, it created a situation where the rival blocs, the inter-imperialist blocs, that is the Western-backed NATO alliance and the Russian and Commonwealth of Independent States, as it was at the time, are in competition with each other. The US was determined to make sure that Russia would never be able to be an actual global rival, and began a process of trying to surround Russia. So when Vladimir Putin does talk about the fact that NATO reneged on the promises to surround Russia, he's absolutely correct. And for Russia, it meant that at some point in the process, there was going to be a conflict for them to be able to maintain any kind of control over countries that they consider to be part of their sphere of influence. And so that NATO expansion really is the fountainhead of what we're seeing here. The conflict was brewing. It was always on a knife's edge, and over the course of the past decades has been getting worse. And the only thing that we have really seen from the Western powers is sending more and more armaments to the region, making it a significantly more unstable and making it a significantly more dangerous place. Much of this also stems from one of the major events in this timeline when you look at Russia and Ukraine, which was the Maidan protests, the Euromaidan protests that happened in 2014 to overthrow the Russian-backed government in Ukraine. There were mass demonstrations, as people may remember from the history. I was able to find my talk that I did in 2014 on this topic to sort of dig into some of the details on it. There were mass protests in opposition to the Russian-backed oligarchs. They were opposed to corruption. They were opposed to police brutality. They were opposed to rampant economic inequality that existed in the country at the time. There is an argument that is being made right now saying that the entire Maidan protests were led by the far right and led by fascist forces. This isn't actually correct. There were certainly fascist forces involved, and they were doing everything that they possibly could to be able to maintain control and to sort of gain power and to gain hegemony throughout those demonstrations. But there were also millions of other Ukrainians who had very legitimate concerns with the government that existed, who were also on the streets. The protests that ultimately overthrew the Yanukovych government could not have happened without them. And certainly, again, as I say, there were far-right elements, and those far-right elements are doing whatever they possibly can to exert their power over the government in Ukraine. And we don't want to dismiss what those people actually represent, and I'll get more into that when I talk about Canada's role. But at the same time, it wasn't quite so simple. There were legitimate reasons for Ukrainians to rise up. So we're looking at a specific context now, though. Why has this happened? If this conflict has existed for decades, why is it actually brewing right now? Well, there's a series of things to specifically look at. One is the obvious decline of the US empire. There has been over the course of the past almost, well, 20 years now, we're looking at 2001 when they invaded Afghanistan. We've seen consistent defeats of the US in various different spots around the world. The Iraqi people fought back against the US. The people of Afghanistan fought back to such an extent that the US and NATO-led NATO partners were forced to pull out earlier this year, showing significant weakness. There was also a moment where Russia actually gained the upper hand in the conflict in Syria by siding with the Assad government, which gives them a tremendous amount of confidence to be able to actually push a little bit further along. And the other element, and one thing that I think is actually quite crucial to Putin's calculations, is the fact that we're in the midst of an energy crisis, and particularly Western Europe is in the throes of an energy crisis. And Russia has become the main supplier of oil and gas to Western Europe. This is something the US has been quite explicit about this. Pentagon reports have discussed the fact that they see Western European dependence on Russian oil and gas as a threat to the NATO alliance itself, a threat to the ability to be able to hold the US in its sort of tight relationship, particularly with Germany, with France, and with Italy in particular. Now, there's been a series of things that have happened very recently. The construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was bringing Russian oil and gas directly to Germany, bypassing most of Eastern Europe, was again seen by the US as part of a threat to the NATO alliance. Joe Biden brought it up numerous times in his press conference with the German Chancellor Scholz, and has talked about it in many times subsequently. And so I do believe that Putin's calculation was that Europe, in the midst of an energy crisis, was in a situation where they were not going to shut down Russian oil and gas supplies that were coming through to the country. And so far, he seems to be right. Having said that, that may not last, and it may end up reaching a breaking point, because those other countries in Europe, France, and Germany, and others, are also very dependent on NATO. NATO provides great advantages for them in a number of different ways. It allows them to be part of the US-led imperial structure, which gives them great advantages in economic ways, in military, as far as their military is concerned. And so there's a number of reasons why these countries may end up deciding that they want to stick with NATO, even if it ends up becoming significantly worse for them. Now, what I want to talk about a little bit more tonight too is what is happening with Canada. What is Canada's role in this whole situation? Canada has played an absolutely horrible role. Since the sort of the Maidan protests in particular, Canada has spent billions of dollars, literally, sending troops to various different sections of Eastern Europe. They have sent weaponry, they have sent heavy weaponry, they have sent rockets, they have sent recently CF-18s, which are now stationed very close to the Russian border. The Canadian government says, of course, that they're doing so to be able to build peace in the region. We know full well that filling up an area of conflict with massive amounts of weaponry is a very bad way to bring peace to the region. And ultimately, Canada has been looking for a severing of the ties between Russia and different sections of both Eastern and Western Europe. And they are doing so for very quite obvious reasons, which is Canada wants to be able to replace Russia as the main supplier of oil and gas to Western Europe. And if you're wondering where we get this information, it's really quite explicit. The Canadian Energy Centre, which was set up, of course, by Jason Kenney to promote Canadian oil and gas, has been talking about this for a number of years, and talking about this since the Maidan protests started. And in fact, when the invasion of Russia, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, started this time around, the response on the front page of the Financial Post in Canada was almost gleeful, in the sense that it was arguing that Canada would be able to fill in the role of providing oil and gas to Eastern Europe and to Western Europe. And so Canada and the Canadian oil companies have been pushing on this for a considerable amount of time. If people want to follow this in a strange kind of way, fire onto Twitter and take a look at Sonia Savage, who is the Alberta Energy Minister, who can't stop talking about Ukraine right now. They just released a new, fairly new, I guess it was a couple of days ago now, Canadian Energy Centre just released a new op-ed talking about how Canada, it's a really bizarre read. Essentially what they're saying is that while Canada and the Trudeau government was sort of concerned about the question of climate change and listening to what they describe as the climate catastrophists, therefore reducing Canadian oil and gas production, or at least not expanding it as quickly as some of these oil companies would like, it allowed Russia to come in and to be the main supplier of oil and gas to Europe. And that ultimately this is a failure of the Canadian government and something that needs to be rectified. And they specifically talk about the fact that, of course, Canadian oil and gas is not oligarchic oil and gas, which is hilarious because, of course, there's Canadian oil and gas oligarchs as well. We use different names. We call them billionaires, but either way, that's the way it's being put forward. And the right in Canada, in particular, the right that is centered around the oil and gas industry, is on an offensive right now. This most recent op-ed finishes with the last couple of sentences are, Canadians must rethink energy policy. The humanitarian approach to global peace and security is to produce more oil and gas, not to persecute it. And so the Canadian sort of ruling class is very, very keen on this war actually continuing to sever those ties. They're hoping to see significant bans on Russian oil and gas, and they're talking about the idea of being able to increase LNG capacity as well. Sonia Savage, by just a little sort of anecdote on this, the US government, people may have heard, in an attempt to stabilize global oil supplies, decided to meet with the Venezuelan government, who had been under sanctions by the US, and to try to get Venezuelan oil to be able to stabilize global supplies. The Alberta government is furious about this. They feel that there should be Canadian bitumen that is being used to stabilize these supplies. Sonia Savage is in Houston, was it today, I think? There was a conference that was being held. She's organizing oil lobbyists in the US to be able to expand and to renew the Keystone XL pipeline to be able to make up for this. So there is a direct tie between this, of course, and the question of climate change in Canada, and the question of resistance to the fossil fuel sector, which I think is an interesting element when we start talking about what it is that we can do here to be able to push back on this. Now, there's been demonstrations in various different spots around the world, of course. People saw the demonstrations here in Toronto, and I know that Faylene had mentioned the demonstrations that were happening in Russia. These are absolutely crucial that these demonstrations develop, because we're not just looking at this particular round of conflict, but we understand that this is part of a larger inter-imperial geopolitical conflict that is going to that has the potential to expand into a much larger war, and has the potential to expand again, ultimately into World War III. We need to make sure that we are building mobilizations that can push back on this and that can stop it. The question, of course, is how to do so. There's a bunch of different ideas that are being put forward. The Ukrainian-led demonstrations in Canada, who unfortunately do have ties to Ukrainian fascist groups, some of which the Canadian government was also arming and training in Ukraine. And they are not in control of the country, but they are certainly a problem, and certainly something that we should not support. And so at the Ukrainian demonstrations here, we did actually see some of the Banderist flags and some of the flags of Ukrainian nationalist movements, which are coming from the far right. And their call is for the no-fly zone in Ukraine. And again, we need to push back on this because it would be devastating. A no-fly zone is a massive expansion of the war that will bring more hostile forces into this. And so for us, if we're talking about what our calls are, One is no to escalation. We cannot have an escalation of the war based on the development of no-fly zones and or the sending of more troops and more armaments to the region. So uh, the call that we put out was no to the war in Ukraine and Canada out of Eastern Europe. Canada's role, as I say, has been horrible throughout the entire time. They simply keep sending more weaponry and they keep arming more fascists in various different spots, including in Ukraine. None of this is going to make things better for the Ukrainian people and is ultimately going to lead to a much more dangerous situation. We also need, I think, as part of this, I think that there are some really good campaigns that are already up and running that we can actually be a part of, including the campaign against the new fighter jets. Anything that we can be doing right now to push back against Canadian militarism, I think is going to be positive. I sent the chat, or Christina, a link to the chat to post in the chat there from the No Fighter Jets Coalition. They have a parliamentary petition that has just been sponsored and is being put forward to try to shut this down. Canada is expected to spend roughly $80 billion for the life cycle costs of new fighter jets. And again, this is not something that is going to be able to bring peace to this situation. We don't know what will happen when those fighter jets are actually commissioned. We need to, therefore, okay, no escalation, Canada out of Eastern Europe, support the Russian anti-war movement. There are significant demonstrations, as we have talked about. We have posted stuff up on Socialist.Ca's Facebook page and on our Twitter as well, so people can send letters of solidarity in support of Russian socialists who have been arrested at various different demonstrations within Russia in opposition to the war. I think that Vladimir Putin is quite surprised and probably quite scared about exactly how big some of these demonstrations have been. Thousands of people, mainly young people, going out onto the streets, no to Putin, no to war. The comrades there with their no war but class war materials have been out on the streets as well. There is, of course, debates within the anti-war movement in Russia, as there are debates within the anti-war movement here in Canada, but it's ultimately really crucial that we end up supporting those mobilizations. And so the calls, Canada out of Europe or Eastern Europe and no to NATO expansion, I think are going to be quite crucial for us. There is a thread in the Canadian anti-war movement as well, though, that takes a very, very pro-Russia line that is going to be problematic and ultimately is not something that is going to be able to build a mass anti-war movement. When we were building the mass anti-war movements against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we made sure that the calls were simple and clear, that people could get behind. And so ultimately, those are the calls. There is another element which I did mention when we're talking about the fact that the Canadian fossil fuel companies are exerting a tremendous amount of pressure on the government around the Ukraine question. Anything that we can do to reduce the strength and power of the Canadian oil and gas oligarchs in this country, I think is going to be incredibly important in the coming months. And we know what that means in Canada. We know that that means standing with Indigenous land defenders who are trying to shut down the CGL pipeline, trying to shut down the TMX pipeline. When we think back to an earlier phase in this conflict, the attempts by Canadian oil and gas companies to expand fracked gas pipelines were challenged mainly by the heroic resistance of the Mi'kmaq people in Ossipogtog, who stood up in opposition to the pipelines there. And so I do believe that that's an element of what we can think about when we're talking about this. But if we're talking about building a broad-based anti-war movement in Canada, we need to be clear. The main enemy is at home. The Canadian state is not interested in any way, shape, or form in peace, nor do they care about the people of Ukraine. They care about making money for Canadian corporations, and that's what they're continuing to push. And so ultimately, this is the way we know war works. War is a moment when there is a conflict between various different capitalist blocs and their imperial ambitions run into each other. And this is what we're seeing right now. It's the thing that we need to sort of oppose as much as possible. So I think the call is very clear. end the war in Ukraine and Canada out of Eastern Europe. And if we can continue to build an anti-war movement in this country based around those ideas, rather than getting into sort of more conflict around questions of fly zones and support for the Russia, which I do think are dead ends for the movement, that's the kind of thing that we can use to be able to build up a proper broad-based movement in this country to push back against our government, to push back against the inevitable wars to come. So I will leave it there.